things. I say that to say where that has taken me on both sides of my master's degree is working with very vulnerable adults, youth, families. I feel like I kind of fell off of a cliff backwards into working with homeless individuals, and from that, people in the forensic system, so criminally justice involved folks, and I found that I like it quite a lot. My favorite job was working in federal prison, so federal offense, sometimes people in for very violent, repetitive offenses, sometimes for life, never getting out, but they will come to my group because it's something to do, and you might get 18 months knocked off your sentence somewhere. Where that led me though was figuring out with our youth, how do we stop the trajectory before we get there? And so most recently, I worked as an executive director running a small but sizable nonprofit agency in Washington, D.C. serving homeless individuals. And we are coming to more and more of an understanding of how for many years in Washington, D.C. in particular, we have a very visible homeless population. It's a bit embarrassing in many places in our country. We've actually solved homelessness. The nation's capital, the White House, the president, we have people sleeping on the street and dying on the streets every single day. I know 3 of them that have died in the last few weeks. We've had terrible floods. One of my favorite clients washed away and drowned. It's devastating, and it's even more devastating and terrifying when you realize there are young children living outside with no means to get help because all of our laws, at least in the states, either feed you into the child welfare system if you are identified, or return you to what might not be the best relationship, no questions asked, and we just need some middle ground. So where my research has gone is trying to figure out, I think in one of the earlier keynotes, it talked about how the very tip of the iceberg are the youth and the children who are known to us. That below, that bigger part of the iceberg is where my research stemmed from. I, in doing the work, had identified all these kids that were I was trying to do research on adults, and all these kids kept coming up, and I thought, well, somebody should study them. We need to find this out. So the original purpose of my study, I feel like we know a lot about risk factors for homelessness and risk factors for transitioning aged youth. What I wanted to know is what works. The kids who never make it onto any person's radar screen, any provider, the kids who are homeless in youth or in childhood, but then they make it. How does that work, and how can we take a piece of that and use it to inform the systems of care and the laws so that we can help all youth do that on purpose? So the purpose of the study was basically looking at the life experiences of adults who had experienced youth in childhood. So you'll see my methodology in a moment. But it was a matched sample. Everybody in the sample experienced homelessness at least one time in childhood or adolescence, with or without family, and half of the sample continued to re-experience homelessness in adulthood. My initial criteria was simply that you re-experienced it one time. What actually happened is nobody who experienced homelessness in adulthood only had one more episode. Everybody had multiple episodes. The other half of the sample did not. So I was looking to understand the patterns of life experiences that not only contribute to the risk factors, we know a lot about them, but less about what grouping and what, if you will, dosage or amount of intensity needs to happen in order to be a real risk factor. I also was interested in figuring out how this can be applied to service practice models. So the problem, some of this, I'm going to go through quickly. We know a lot about risk factors. We know that when we experience things as children, such as homelessness, child abuse, low education rates, like all these things are sort of bidirectional in terms of their correlation, right? So you might experience poverty and homelessness, and in the home there's more stress, and as a result there might be a little bit more of a risk for abuse. Not always, but that seems to, sometimes one can lead to the other, but it goes the other way too. Children and youth who experience trauma at home, witness family violence, are more likely to run away, are more likely to have lower academic achievement, are more likely to end up with mental health issues and also health issues. I think one thing that gets minimized a lot is the impact that all types of child abuse have on physical well-being. Children who are abused, I presented this in a study a few years ago, are actually much more likely to have long-term physical illness, so chronic illnesses, autoimmune disorders, disorders. There are more recent studies looking into the mechanism of that are Journal of American Medical Journal and others recently published on, but another topic for another time. But the point being that there is far-reaching impact, and so it's a problem we should understand, because we talk about it in terms of youth and the cost to the future and the individual youth, but this is the future of our world. These are all of our children. This is the tomorrow that we can help paint right now. So these were the research questions. So looking at what psychosocial and systemic environmental experiences contribute to homelessness of adults who experience homelessness in their youth, what psychosocial and systemic environmental experiences protect against homelessness of these adults, and what specific experiences contributed to the stability in housing between episodes of homelessness, or in the case certainly of the youth who never re-experienced it. How did they do that? How did that happen? So my methodology, this was a very simple design. It was an exploratory qualitative study, simply because nobody had written about this before. And I have only seen 2 other studies nationwide, and it's a real problem, and I'm glad to see that there's starting to be more interest put into it, not just in the US, it is a problem across the world. So this was a purposive sample, as you can imagine. The 20 adults, this is retrospective, so these were anybody under the age of 30, which had experienced homelessness in their youth, and also half of them also again in adulthood. As you can imagine, the 10 who re-experienced homelessness in adulthood were easy to find. Shelters on the street itself, different organizations. It was like turning over rocks to find the sample that had been homeless as youth and went on to a very normal life. So fortunately, they found me on the internet, on college campuses, interestingly enough, doctors' offices. Once people understood what I was recruiting for, they were more than happy to help. But it took 2 years for me to find 20 cases to study. Of course, our human subjects considerations, we did, of course, acknowledge that even with the adult population, they're very vulnerable. Most of this I took care of through consent, which we did read to folks, because the understanding and acknowledgement, even as I did my literature review, was that a lot of our folks did not finish school. Many had literacy issues, many had cognitive and comprehension issues, and what I observed, just also being a clinician, many were very affected by their trauma, and you could see the slower cognitive processing that went on. And so we actually took the time to read the consents to everyone. They had an option to opt out at any time. I had 2 subjects call after the interview several weeks later and ask if they could opt out, which of course I let them, but also refer to mental health providers, because there seemed to be some aspect of potential paranoia or other psychotic condition that required at least some level of assessment. And of course, as a researcher, I couldn't do that. Did address rigor and trustworthiness. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of it, but sort of the usual ways. The nice thing for me is those 2 studies I just spoke of were published in the last couple of years, which allowed me the ability to triangulate some of my data and findings. That was not what I thought was going to be available to me when I first started, so that was a relief. So the sample that was homeless in youth only, this was 10 of the 20 interviews. The youngest was 20 years old, the oldest was 29. 50% of this group were first-generation Americans, and by that, 3 of them were not born here, and the other 2 were, but they were the first in the family. This was a shocking finding. Don't ask why. I know I live in Washington, D.C., but I did not expect that. 70% were women, 90% were parents. The one who was not a parent was a 20-year-old college student. So it was interesting, because this was not exactly what I expected to find in this sample, but made it quite interesting. One of the most interesting things between the 2, you'll see in a moment, is that there were some very similar contextual issues, which surprised me, coming from really a quarter of my whole entire sample being immigrants. So anyway, so the other half who were homeless in youth and adulthood, the youngest was 19 at the time of the interview, the oldest was 29. All 10, of course, re-experienced homelessness over the age of 18. and 7 were homeless at the time of the interview. The others were either potentially housed on their own or had been housed for some time. When I say homeless, what I mean is you do not have your own bedroom. So if you're doubled up on someone's couch, if you're in the homeless shelter, if you're sleeping on the park bench, if you are couch surfing, if you're with a relative that could be kicked out any minute, I counted you as homeless. 40% of this sample were women, 60% were men. We had an ethnically diverse group. I did not do that on purpose, but could not have planned that better. So 30% Latino, 30% Caucasian, 30% African American, and 10% identified as multiracial. So my analysis is really quite interesting and quite simple in a way. It was just a very simple thematic analysis. I used Atlas TI, but I also spent a lot of time crawling around my living room floor with printed out copies of the interviews. So I see a few laughs, so there are some qualitative researchers out there. See what I'm talking about. So both groups identified the following risk factors in common, and so substance abuse disorders in the family. And so it was not necessarily the youth who experienced it. In some cases it was, but apparently it was enough to have one parent who was engaged in active substance use over a long period of time. Complicated grief was a huge factor. There was a lot of loss in this population. That went across both groups. Strained family relationships prior to age 18, obviously something led to, actually this entire sample, all 20, not one person had, so I'll say it the other way. There was not a single subject in the 20 who did not at some point end up homeless on their own. So all that to say, at some point, as part of the whole family, they may have been homeless before 18, but every one of my 20 subjects were homeless on their own, separated from family at some point. So there were, when I say strained family relations, I mean seriously strained, and experienced trauma or abuse. This was also on both sides of homelessness. This might have been at home or with another caretaker, but this also often occurred on the street once they were homeless. You can probably imagine what it's like being young and naive and being dependent on other folks who may or may not have their own needs and interest in what you're doing out there and your vulnerability. So the interesting thing was, so group 2, and this is the group that was homeless in youth and adulthood, they reported no supportive relationships during the transition to adulthood. They couldn't identify even one person who was there in any consistent way. Limited educational achievement. Many reported, I believe my person who completed the most school went through 9th grade. And lots of ongoing health issues, diabetes, hypertension, and already these are young adults. Some heart disease, also some organic things, some seizure disorders, some other neurological kinds of things going on. Lots and lots of gastrointestinal issues, GERD, acid reflux issues. We had several with autoimmune disorders, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. There was quite a list of health issues, given that these are people under the age of 30. Limited access to treatment or consistent access to healthcare for obvious reasons. In the US, like I said, you present to a healthcare provider, you're an unaccompanied youth. 1, under a certain age, you can't consent for treatment. 2, we now have to call CPS because you're not properly supervised and potentially being abused or neglected. Also, the interesting thing was every one of the 10 in this part of my sample used these exact words: not feeling safe anywhere. Can't imagine being a kid and not feeling safe anywhere, but being a kid on the street and not feeling safe anywhere. So in group 1, they also saw, it was sort of the opposite. In this group, and I'd like to explore this more, and I talk about it in future directions, but they had the ability to draw support from multiple people despite limitations in those relationships. What I mean is, we identified family issues, but they might say, well, that aunt was good if I needed to just cry on the phone with somebody. Or, well, my mom would give me $5 when I really came around, but I knew not to do it very often. They had a certain, whether it was internal resilience of their own way of kind of pulling this piece from that person and that piece from that person, observing that person, in order to create a composite of, what I sort of feel like is sort of its own mirroring of monotropy, which is an attachment term for those of you that know it, that we talk about in the infant creating one bond with one caregiver, whichever caregiver that is, it's almost as if I saw a parallel in adolescence of that innate drive to do that for survival. So that would be an interesting thing to continue to consider. If anyone wants to go in on a study with me on that, please see me after. Also, employment at age 18. Many of the youth who made it had just figured out a way to make it work. They did not want to live on the street. They did not want to engage in a life of illegal activity. They may be at the time, but anybody who was working through legitimate or less legitimately legal means did better. And the other protective factor, having children to care for, which was surprising to me. But having children before 18, we know, is a risk factor for a lot of negative outcomes. In this case, it protected a lot against homelessness because there was this sense of, whatever happens to me, I don't care, but I'm not dragging this baby through the life that I just lived. And so many identified that, and also some educational achievement. Often that was related to the children, with the exception of the one college student who had no children. But her identification was that if I do everything just right, maybe I can go to college and get away from here. And she did. Access to therapy and other health care was another issue. Some of these youth were in foster care and had better access than other youth who were not. So just briefly, my discussion. So of course, both groups reported some stability between episodes of homelessness. The risk factors were similar between the groups. It did seem that there was more severity, either intensity or duration of all of those risk factors for group 2. There were fewer identified resources in group 2, and some of that, again, personal resiliency probably plays some factor, but it wasn't measured in this study. And also having children to care for, like I said, that was the surprising bit of resilience, but it was that many identified wanting to do better for this child than they felt was done for them as a carer. And again, the interesting parallel to the idea of monotropy in group 1 was a single identified caregiver. So in group 2, it seemed like there was an inability to either form or create that bond or the availability of anyone to bond with. But these are adolescents where we don't think of this as key, but if you think about it another way, at what point does the brain actually stop growing and developing? Versus where do we cut the line off and say this is adulthood, now you're on your own. But what seemed to create extra resilience in group 1, where they were not homeless again, was not only the ability to create a composite so that they sort of mimicked that monotropic relationship, but also that they often had access to or were able to generate a relationship with a single carer in order to sort of create a surrogate into adulthood. So some directions for future research. I would love to do this as a larger study, even just the qualitative part of it, just get a larger sample. And I would actually like to look at this not just nationally, but internationally. Of course, we'd have to ask things differently across cultures, but coming from a Southeast Asian culture myself, I am curious about this a bit. Some problems are similar, and some problems look different, and societally, I would be surprised if we didn't have some things in common that we should work on collectively. I'm curious about where trafficking comes into all of this, because it doesn't seem to matter what continent you started off on. Unfortunately, people are winding up anywhere. And then also looking at immigrant refugee children, because this is getting to be a bigger issue. I'm sure you all have seen the United States on the front page of many papers for many weeks, and it is disturbing, but a real problem for social workers and psychologists and all of our healthcare workers for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. And then identification of strategies for intervention, not just individually. Of course, we want to work with the individuals, but on a larger systemic level, homelessness, child maltreatment, all these things, poverty, all these things exist because as a society, we have not put our foot down and said enough. We have enough, especially somewhere like the United States. We have enough. We need to make a decision to prioritize things, and the way to do it, I would like to see more data behind it so that we can get some momentum. Sorry that went a little long. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Firstly, I would like to say that as a qualitative researcher who's also working with homeless children, kudos on the presentation, was terrific. A lot of data crunched into small time. My question is, during the thematic analysis, did you ever consider resilience as a theme among these children? Because mid-research, we pointed it out that what are the ways we can actually help them. And because I'm working on observational learning and having peers or seniors you can model or learn from actually forms and paves the path because we observe a lot from them. So did you consider that?
So actually, the attempt on this was one better than that. Resilience we look at as one single factor, but what do we mean? So what I was looking at here, the reason it was qualitative was to figure out what are all the things we're calling resilience. Because step 2, and we should talk after this, I would love to design a tool and look at how do we figure out what are all those things that make up resilience, and then how do we measure it in a way that will make the quantitative world understand what we do.
Actually, the question was saying.
I'll be around if anyone has other questions as well.